Imagine this. It's 1976. London's Victoria Station. The crowd erupts as David Bowie arrives. Cameras flash. Fans scream. Then he lifts his arm. And just like that, history captures a moment that would stain his legacy for decades. Was it a Nazi salute? Was it misunderstood stage theatrics? Or was it the breaking point of a man lost in the persona he created? Before you rush to judgment, ask yourself, how often have we praised artistic madness, only to recoil when it reveals itself too honestly? Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We uncover the stories behind the imagery masking fame, fame's illusion, and the truths that get buried beneath applause. Today, we dig into the beautiful chaos that was David Bowie. Not just the rock star, not just Ziggy Stardust, but the man behind the mask in the moment that shocked the world. David Bowie wasn't just another British rock star with a flair for reinvention. He was a living question mark. A man who refused to stay in one form long enough for society to pin him down. And maybe that's why we adored him. Or maybe it's why we feared him. Born David Robert Jones in 1947, his beginnings were ordinary by all accounts. Son of a waitress and a promotions officer, nothing foretold the cosmic odyssey he'd embark on. That is, until a scuffle in a schoolyard left him with one permanently dilated pupil, a freak accident. A scar turned into a signature. Already, the universe was drafting Bowie's mythology. As a boy, he worshipped the wild pulse of American music, Little Richard, Elvis, Chuck Berry. But while most kids dream, Bowie transmuted those dreams into being. He didn't just mimic his idols. He absorbed them, repurposed them, birthed new identities from their bones. From the Conrads to the King Bees to the Manish Boys, Bowie bounced through bands like a soul refusing to settle. But here's where it gets interesting. Each failure didn't break him. It sharpened his edge. Even when he flirted with monastic life in a Buddhist temple, the world dragged him back, reminding him, your pulpit is the stage. Bowie's early life wasn't tragic in the conventional sense, but it simmered with dissonance, his half-brother Terry battling schizophrenia, mentors who blurred lines between love and influence, and relationships that collapsed under the weight of his inner chaos. If you listen closely, his songs weren't just stories, they were screams muffled beneath style. Then came Ziggy Stardust, alien messiah, glam prophet of a gender-fluid galaxy. Ziggy wasn't just a character. He was a seduction. Fans didn't watch Bowie perform Ziggy. They believed Ziggy was real. And that's the danger. Because so did Bowie. By the time he took the Hammersmith stage in 1973 and declared Ziggy was retiring, the line between David and Ziggy had already blurred beyond repair. Fame is a high-voltage current. Bowie, like Icarus, was flying too close to its burn. So what happened in 1976? When Bowie raised that hand, was it the thin white duke speaking a persona cold, fascist-tinged, and dangerously charismatic? Was it Bowie drowning in addiction, detached from consequence? Or was it the culmination of years spent feeding personas that devoured their maker? We don't answer those questions lightly. We ask them because they matter. In an era obsessed with cancel culture, with decontextualized images and viral outrage, the Bowie salute forces us to examine something deeper. What happens when the artist's creation becomes the cage? Stick around, because this story isn't about vindicating Bowie. It's about challenging our Sylvesto, see how far we'll go to crown genius, and whether we're prepared to face the cracks that come with it. To understand that infamous moment at Victoria Station, we have to trace the fault lines that led there. Because David Bowie didn't become a myth overnight, constructed himself piece by jagged piece, often while trying to outrun his own reflection. Born into post-war England, Bowie's early years were outwardly mundane. He wasn't born a star, made himself into one. His family was working class, stable but unremarkable. Yet from childhood, he stood out not for rebellion, but for imagination. Teachers recalled a boy with striking poise, a talent for movement and mimicry. The seeds of something larger were already taking root. But it wasn't until his father brought home a stack of American records, Little Richard Chief among them, that Bowie's transformation began. Something in the raw, otherworldly shriek of Tutti Frutti cracked open his soul. He didn't just hear music, saw another realm. It was as if he'd caught a glimpse of a version of himself not yet born. He picked up instruments like he was possessed: ukulele, piano, bass. By adolescence, he was performing in local clubs, channeling Elvis and Chuck Berry with a confidence that startled adults. But here's the irony. Despite all that charisma, he couldn't seem to stick with a band. From the Conrads to the King Bees to the Manish Boys, Bowie changed collaborators as often as he changed costumes later in life. Some would call it ambition, others, a restless search for self. Either way, the pattern was clear. David Bowie was not meant to blend in. He was meant to break free. But breaking free isn't painless. A fight with a schoolmate left him with permanent eye damage, his left pupil forever dilated. In another man, it would have been a lifelong insecurity. In Bowie, it became a signature. That either way it caught light became a metaphor for everything he'd become. Uncanny, beautiful, a little unsettling. Yet the emotional bruises ran deeper. His half-brother Terry, a brilliant but troubled figure, suffered from schizophrenia and spent long stretches institutionalized. For Bowie, Terry was a beacon and a warning. He introduced David to beat poetry, jazz, and existential philosophy, but also showed him the precipice of mental collapse. That duality haunted Bowie for life. In his music, you can hear the conversation between them, the dreamer and the ghost. And then there was his sexuality, or more accurately, the world's obsession with it. Long before it was remotely safe to do so, Bowie proclaimed himself gay, then bisexual, then not quite either. Decades before society learned to distinguish performance from identity, Bowie blurred the lines with a kind of defiant grace. But it wasn't just about headlines. His relationships were tangled, intense, and often explosive. He fell for Dana Gillespie, a fellow musician, when he was 17 and she was just 14. Theirs was a youthful connection that lasted years, both personally and professionally. But true stability eluded him. He later had a romantic and creative entanglement with his dance mentor, Lindsay Kemp, a man whose theatrical flamboyance mirrored Bowie's own emerging alter egos. Kemp claimed to have taught him how to speak with his body, to hold silence as powerfully as sound. Bowie absorbed it all, and then, true to pattern, moved on. Next came Hermione Farthingale, a woman who shared his passion for performance, but not his appetite for chaos. When she left him for a film role, Bowie was devastated. He later admitted the failure was his, couldn't stay faithful. From this heartbreak, he wrote some of his most tender early songs. But emotional vulnerability wasn't enough to slow his forward momentum. In 1969, he married Angela Barnett, a relationship that from the outset felt more transactional than romantic. She would later claim they wed only so she could obtain a work visa. Bowie allegedly told her, point blank, "I'm not in love with you." Still, they had a child, Duncan Jones, later a film director, and cohabited through some of his most turbulent artistic years. And they were turbulent. Bowie's constant shape-shifting wasn't just artistic, it was symptomatic. He didn't live through characters. He dissolved into them. Ziggy Stardust wasn't a costume. It was a full-body possession. And that worked until it didn't. Because when you spend years pretending to be from Mars, it gets harder and harder to feel grounded on Earth. By the early 1970s, Bowie wasn't just performing characters. He was living in them. The man who sold the world marked his shift toward heavier, more experimental music. Its cover, Bowie lounging in a flowing dress, was both a fashion statement and a provocation. But it was more than that. It was camouflage, a way to hide in plain sight. When critics praised it, he leaned further into it. Interviews became performances. Outfits became armor. That period birthed Ziggy. And with Ziggy came the fame Bowie had been chasing for years. Suddenly, he wasn't just making art was the art, but the price was steep. Inhabiting Ziggy consumed him. His sense of self fragmented under the strain. He would later admit he began to lose his grip on reality. Ziggy wouldn't leave me alone. He confessed. Even offstage, the alien messiah lingered like a haunting. And this brings us closer to the core of the Bowie paradox. The more successful he became, the less he could find himself in the mirror. Which leads us to 1976, the height of his fame, the depths of his addiction. Bowie had become the thin white Dookian new persona. Slick, emaciated, stylish, and dangerously vacant. He described the Duke as a nasty character, a hollow man obsessed with power, coldness, and control, and the world loved it. Magazines called him the most stylish man alive. Crowds mimicked his look. Nobody asked whether David was okay. But Bowie wasn't okay. He was barely sleeping, subsisting on milk, peppers, and cocaine. He was reading occult books, making statements about fascism, flirting with imagery that danced too close to fire. He was spinning, fast, and no one could catch him, not even himself. So when that camera snapped at Victoria Station, catching him mid-wave in what looked like a fascist salute, the explosion was inevitable. The image went viral decades before viral was even a word. For many, it was proof of darkness. But for those paying attention, it was a distress signal, a glitch in the simulation Bowie had built around himself. It wasn't just a man raising his arm. It was a man unraveling. It's impossible to dissect Bowie's descent without examining the constellation of people orbiting him, those who influenced, enabled, challenged, or reflected fragments of who he was trying to become. These weren't just supporting characters in a rock star's life. They were catalysts, and sometimes collateral damage. Let's start with Terry Burns, Bowie's half-brother. Schizophrenic, poetic, and fragile, Terry was Bowie's window into a world where the line between brilliance and breakdown was terrifyingly thin. He was more than family. He was a mirror. In Bowie's songs, especially those touched by themes of madness or isolation, you can hear Terry echoing between the verses. Bowie feared ending up like Terry, but also carried guilt for leaving him behind. Terry would eventually die by suicide. The scars of that loss never left Bowie. Then there was Lindsay Kemp, the flamboyant, magnetic dance instructor who taught Bowie far more than choreography. Kemp didn't just move onstage, he existed in full theatrical color. And Bowie, still raw and searching, absorbed him like a sponge. Their connection was layered, mentor and student, performer and protege, lovers for a time. Kemp later said Bowie learned how to touch the public from him. But the truth is more complicated. Bowie learned how to disappear inside a character from Kemp. And perhaps, how to perform vulnerability without ever really revealing himself. Angela Barnett, his first wife, is often treated as a footnote. But she was integral to the Bowie machine. She was sharp, brash, and endlessly self-assured. Some call her the architect behind Bowie's early career, push marketing him, shaping his image, even choosing some of his more daring looks. But theirs was no love story. She later admitted they married so she could get a work permit, and that Bowie warned her, "I'm not in love with you." Their union was open, chaotic, fueled by drugs, affairs, and emotional cold wars. Still, they had a son, Duncan, and she stayed through some of his darkest years, perhaps because she understood the business behind the madness better than anyone. Duncan Jones, born Ziggy Bowie, would go on to forge his own path as a respected filmmaker. But during his childhood, he witnessed his father's spirals, his mother's volatility, and the unraveling of a myth in real time. That Bowie retained custody after the divorce says something profound. Even in his messiest years, he understood the importance of anchoring his son away from the chaos that once consumed him. Then came Iggy Pop, arguably the most important presence in Bowie's late 70s life. They weren't just friends or collaborators. They were fellow survivors. When Bowie fled to Berlin in a desperate bid to escape addiction, he brought Iggy with him. And there, in the haze of withdrawal and reinvention, they recorded some of the most significant music of their careers. It was in Iggy's presence that Bowie stopped spiraling and started rebuilding. Not into Ziggy, not into the Duke, but into something closer to David Jones, the man behind the personas. Iggy didn't save Bowie, but he reminded him that survival was possible, and art didn't have to devour you to be real. Of course, there were others. Hermione Farthingale, who left him heartbroken but helped inspire his most sensitive work. Dana Gillespie, his teenage love who remained a creative partner for years. These women, often glossed over in glam retrospectives, were not just muses. They were emotional barometers measuring when Bowie was truly grounded versus when he was spinning out. And then there were the personas themselves, Ziggy Stardust and the Thin White Duke, arguably his most destructive relationships. Ziggy gave him stardom, but also pulled him toward psychosis. He spoke of Ziggy like a haunting, something that clung to him, whispered in his ear even after he retired the character. Ziggy was freedom and entrapment in the same glittering package. Fans adored him. Bowie, eventually, feared him. The Thin White Duke was another matter entirely. Born of addiction, isolation, and a craving for control, the Duke was everything Bowie wasn't. Icy, composed, ruthless. He wore high fashion like armor. He gave interviews in a monotone. He invoked fascist imagery not as satire, but as aesthetic, and people bought it. Critics praised the character's edge. They missed or ignored the warning signs that this wasn't just performance art. It was a cry for help. And around Bowie, the media oscillated wildly. One month, they called him a genius. The next, a fraud. His bisexuality was lauded as trailblazing, then dismissed as a gimmick. His use of drag and androgyny was celebrated by the avant-garde, condemned by the mainstream. The press loved the image of Bowie's sharp cheekbones, genderless beauty, poetic detachment, but showed little interest in the toll it took to maintain that image. When he collapsed, they didn't offer context. They offered headlines. Even his critics, those who accused him of appropriation, of borrowing identities that weren't his to wear, often misunderstood the depth of his internal dislocation. Bowie wasn't playing dress up. He was trying to find a shape that made sense. And sometimes, that shape offended people. Sometimes it scared them. But it was never done for applause alone. It was survival through art. All of this brings us back to the question, who exactly was David Bowie? Was he the sum of the people he encountered? The lovers who shaped him? The addicts who stood beside him? The characters he birthed, then abandoned? Or was he always an observer, collecting fragments of everyone around him, including the broken parts, and turning them into mythology? He once said, "I'm not a prophet or a stone-aged man, just a mortal with potential of a Superman." That quote, equal parts humility and hubris, captures his essence. He was a man who needed others, not just as emotional anchors, but as reflections. He didn't just borrow from them. He built himself out of them, and then, often, left them behind. In the end, the people around Bowie didn't just influence his story. They enabled it, survived it, and in some cases, outlived its consequences. So much of David Bowie's life is defined by questions that never had answers. But maybe that's the point. He was never offering conclusions, she was posing riddles. Wrapped in glitter, cloaked in personas, whispered through lyrics. Still, the most enduring mysteries aren't about the costumes or the music. They're about the choices that made the world recoil and the silences that followed. Start with the Victoria Station incident. A photograph just one frame froze Bowie midwave, his arm at a sharp angle eerily resembling a fascist salute. The fallout was immediate. Headlines screamed. Fans gasped. Critics speculated. But the man at the center didn't offer clarity. Not right away. And that's what made it worse. Was it staged? An accident? A symptom of his drug-induced disintegration? Bowie would later claim it was misunderstood, that he was waving to fans. Others say he was deep in character, embodying the thin white dukkha persona known for its flirtation with fascist imagery. But here's the deeper problem. Bowie blurred the line so well between performance and reality that no one could be sure, not even him. In a 1980 interview, he confessed he'd nearly lost his mind. That's not metaphor. That's a man warning us in hindsight that, for a while, he wasn't driving the machine. And what about the thin white Duke himself? Why did Bowie create a persona so emotionally hollow, so provocatively cold? He described the Duke as a very Aryan, fascist type, a would-be romantic with absolutely no emotion at all, but who spouted a lot of neo-romance. He also admitted he was reading occult books, referencing Aleister Crowley, and spending entire days without sleep or food sustained by cocaine and madness. That wasn't just performance. That was danger dressed as theater. And the public clapped. Then there's the matter of his ever-changing declarations about sexuality. In 1972, Bowie publicly announced he was gay, an act of radical defiance at the time. A few years later, he revised that to bisexual. In the 80s, he called it the biggest mistake I ever made. And later still, he said he'd always been a closet heterosexual. But was that a walk back for career preservation? Was it personal evolution? Or was it, again, the voice of a man unsure where his stage ended and his soul began? For some, these contradictions undermined his authenticity. For others, they were proof of something more profound, a refusal to be caged, even by his own past. But in a world hungry for labels and clarity, Bowie's fluidity was threatening. He wasn't confused. He was unbothered by our confusion. That made him dangerous. Then there's the Buddhist chapter, strange, serene, and often overlooked. In the late 60s, Bowie seriously considered becoming a monk. He studied under a Tibetan Lama, Chime Rinpoche, and began contemplating life outside of music entirely. But Rinpoche told him, simply, you don't want to be Buddhist. You should follow music. That momentous spiritual fork in the road could have changed everything. But Bowie didn't ignore it. He channeled it. You can feel it in his work, the sense of searching, of impermanence, of not quite belonging anywhere, even within himself. Another unresolved tension, Blackstar, his final album, released on his 69th birthday, just 2 days before he died of liver cancer. Fans didn't know he was sick. No press releases, no interviews, just a parting gift drenched in mortality. The lyrics are riddled with cryptic allusions. Look up here. I'm in heaven. The music video for Lazarus shows him levitating above a hospital bed, his eyes blindfolded. Was this Bowie's ultimate performance? Or was it the first time he stepped out from behind the curtain and showed us what mortality really looked like? The fact that even in death, he chose mystery over spectacle tells you everything you need to know about him. For Bowie, control wasn't just about art, it was about boundaries. Even when unraveling, he curated how we saw him, or didn't. And yet, the public's appetite for his secrets never waned. They dissected his lyrics, his outfits, his stage banter. They built theories around his marriage to Amon, speculated endlessly about his health, his beliefs, his regrets, and Bowie always one step ahead played into it, and simultaneously mocked it. He understood that mystery was more powerful than confession, that ambiguity fuels obsession. Still, some questions cut deeper. Why did he flirt with imagery so close to totalitarianism? Why did he never fully address the fascist overtones of the thin white Duke era with seriousness, instead brushing them off as a mistake of addiction? Why did he publicly deny being a symbol for the LGBTQ+ community, even after being celebrated as one of its early icons? Why did he always keep one foot outside the movements he helped inspire? Perhaps it was fear. Perhaps it was rebellion. Perhaps it was the knowledge that once you let the world define you, it owns you. In that sense, Bowie's contradictions weren't accidents. They were resistance strategies. A way of saying, I will not be flattened. I will not be simplified. I will not be yours to claim. But those strategies came at a cost. They left confusion in their wake, hurt feelings, misinterpretations, political landmines, emotional ambiguity. People projected themselves onto Bowie because he was a blank canvas, but that also meant they felt betrayed when the painting changed. What remains most haunting is this: for all his transformations, Bowie never shed the skin of being unknowable. Even now, long after his death, we're still asking, who was he, really? And perhaps the answer is, he was whoever he needed to be to survive that moment. And that might be the most honest answer of all. By now, one thing is clear: David Bowie didn't simply perform musique, performed reality. Or perhaps more accurately, he blurred it until no one, not even he, could tell where the show ended. And that raises uncomfortable questions not just about him, but about us, the audience, the admirers, the consumers of myth. What is the cost of genius when it feeds off fragmentation? Is it fair to elevate a man whose greatest art was born from breakdown? And at what point does creative freedom cross into a kind of public self-destruction with cameras rolling and critics applauding? This isn't about moralizing. It's about reckoning with the consequences of turning a human into a symbol. Bowie wanted to be more than a man, but he never claimed he wanted to be our avatar, our representative, or our myth. We chose that for him. We crowned him as the genderless saint of reinvention, the prophet of alienation, the savior of the misfits. And then we expected him to never falter. But artists are not built to carry that weight. And in Bowie's case, it fractured him. He once said, "Fame itself, it's not real. It's a construct, and it's a dangerous one." Yet he couldn't walk away from it, because fame, like any addiction, offers just enough reward to numb the damage. And Bowie, for all his intelligence and foresight, was not immune. When we look at personas like Ziggy Stardust or the Thin White Duke, we often speak in terms of creative brilliance. But rarely do we ask, what kind of mind creates those characters and what toll does embodying them exact? Ziggy was colorful chaos, bursting with sexual ambiguity and cosmic loneliness. The Duke was emptiness incarnate, a man-shaped void in an Armani suit. Both were admired. Both were unlivable. Bowie couldn't be Ziggy without melting down. He couldn't be the Duke without becoming dangerously cold. And yet, we still applaud the transformation. Why? Because deep down, we love the spectacle of unraveling, especially when it's wrapped in style. We talk about losing yourself in the role as if it's noble, as if it doesn't hollow a person out. But Bowie told us, again and again, that it nearly destroyed him. Why didn't we listen? There's also a deeper, more troubling implication in how we viewed his struggles. When Bowie was gaunt, paranoid, talking about aliens and reading Nazi literature during his coke-fueled Los Angeles years, the world didn't intervene. They photographed him. They wrote profiles about his eccentricity. But what if he hadn't been famous? What if he'd been an anonymous man in a cheap apartment talking about being from another planet? Would we still call him a visionary, or would we call for help? That's the paradox of fame. It turns red flags into fashion statements. Bowie, in his darkest moments, was often lauded instead of helped. The media loved the spectacle, and fans often saw pain as depth, addiction as authenticity. But real suffering isn't aesthetic. It's invisible until it breaks through the facade. And still, we're left with this uneasy admiration. Because in spite of, or maybe because fall that inner chaos, Bowie created beauty. He gave us Space Oddity, Life on Mars, Heroes, Ashes to Ashes, and Blackstar. He gave voice to the weird, the displaced, the ones who didn't fit the mold. He validated confusion as a legitimate form of being. That matters. But here's the real question. Do we love Bowie because he was broken, or because he disguised it so well? Do we admire his honesty, or only the version of it that fits neatly into a Spotify playlist? There's also the complicated issue of representation. Bowie was hailed as a queer icon, a gender revolutionary, a progressive voice. But he often rejected those labels. He didn't want to be pinned down. He wasn't interested in movements. He wanted to float above them, untethered. That made him frustrating to activists. But perhaps it was the only honest way he could exist. He wasn't a flag bearer. He was a prism refracting whatever light was thrown at him. That doesn't lessen his impact. It deepens it, because it suggests something radical. Maybe you don't have to be certain to be sincere. Maybe ambiguity is its own form of truth. Still, it's worth asking, did Bowie's legacy open doors, or did it simply make people admire the doorway? For all his provocations, how many artists truly followed in his steps? How many dared to reinvent themselves so fully that they became unrecognizable? Most settled for aesthetic shifts, not existential ones. Because what Bowie did wasn't just branding, it was transformation through combustion. And transformation at that level is dangerous. It's radioactive. It can't be sustained. That's why we remember Bowie the way we do not as a man, but as an eclipse. Brief, blinding, unforgettable. So perhaps the real story here isn't about a man who lost himself in the characters he played. It's about a culture that prefers the character over the man. A society that demands vulnerability as performance but punishes it in reality. A fan base that worships rebellion but recoils when it gets too real. And Bowie, ever the observer, ever the shapeshifter, knew this. He played into it. And he played with it. But in the end, it's fair to wonder, was he performing us just as much as he was performing himself? And so we arrive at the final act, not just of David Bowie's career, but of the man himself. When most artists fade, they drift into silence or nostalgia. But Bowie did something disturbingly brilliant. He turned his death into a stage, his exit into a script. Blackstar, his final album, wasn't just a swan song, it was a requiem he wrote while dying. A controlled burn. A performance art piece cloaked in jazz, riddled with symbolism, laced with riddles only the dying would dare write. Let's be clear, this wasn't just a last record. It was a calculated confrontation with mortality. Every note, every lyric on Blackstar reverberates with decay and transcendence. Look up here. I'm in heaven. He sings in Lazarus, not metaphorically, but almost journalistically. Bowie didn't whisper about death. He stared it down. He choreographed it. He released the album 2 days before dying, as if to say, watch carefully. This is how a myth ends. But is that braver? Is it a final mask? Some critics saw Blackstar as a gift to fans, an artist's dignified farewell. Others saw it as one last performance from a man who could never live outside the lens. Either way, the impact was seismic. Social media lit up in disbelief. How could someone die and still seems so present. So strategic. So composed. Only Bowie could pull off a death that felt like an encore. Yet Blackstar is not easy to digest. It's cryptic, chaotic, unsettling. It's not an album for the casual fan, it's a puzzle box. And that feels intentional. Bowie wasn't seeking pity or legacy polish. He was digging into deeper territory. What does it mean to die in public? Can you control your own ending in a world that dissects everything? Can you, in effect, direct your own obituary? And maybe more provocatively, should you? The conversation around Blackstar reveals our own discomfort with death. We celebrate Bowie's courage, but beneath that applause is a quiet anxiety. He made dying look like art, and that sets a dangerous precedent. Because real death, raw, messy, unfair, doesn't always allow for symmetry or poetic lyrics. Not everyone gets to go out wrapped in symbolism and saxophones. But then again, maybe that was the point. Bowie didn't try to universalize death. He individualized it. He didn't offer answers. He offered atmosphere. He didn't pretend to be immortal. He leaned into the abyss and took us with him. There's something undeniably haunting about the fact that Blackstar ends not with resolution, but with fragmentation. The final track, I Can't Give Everything Away, is not a confession, it's a refusal. It suggests that even after all the characters, all the reinventions, all the supposed openness, there were still doors he wouldn't unlock, still parts of him that remained sealed. And that, perhaps, is the deepest truth Bowie ever offered us. That mystery is not a gimmick. It's a form of protection. And in a world addicted to exposure, preserving mystery is an act of rebellion. So what do we make of it all? The glitter, the personas, the alien chic, the coke-addled paranoia, the Berlin detox, the art rock, the acting, the collapse and resurgence, the final whisper of jazz and shadow. Maybe Bowie's greatest act wasn't becoming Ziggy or the Thin White Duke. Maybe it wasn't even Blackstar. Maybe it was enduring, surviving decades of scrutiny without letting the world consume him completely. Or maybe it was the opposite. Maybe he did let the world consume him and made art from the ashes. Either way, we are left not with a clean narrative, but a constellation of contradictions. A man who was private yet performative, brave yet broken, futuristic yet nostalgic, and always one step ahead. But here's the uncomfortable truth. For all the talk about how ahead of his time Bowie was, we never really caught up. Not fully. We mimicked his style. We quoted his lyrics. We dissected his looks, but we never truly understood the cost of that kind of creative combustion. We cheered for the fire, but we rarely asked what it was burning. In the end, Bowie leaves behind more than music. He leaves behind a blueprint for how to live, if not comfortably, then consciously. He showed us that reinvention is survival, that fluidity is strength, that embracing contradiction isn't weakness, it's evolution. And most importantly, he reminded us that even in a world obsessed with clarity, it's okay to remain opaque, that not every truth must be spoken. Some can be sung, some can be worn, and some, like Bowie himself, can only be felt in echoes. As the dust settles on his final performance, one thing becomes painfully clear: David Bowie didn't just shape culture. He reflected it back at us, warped, glittering, broken, beautiful. And now, in his absence, we're left to ask, what do we do with the mirror he left behind? And so, we reach the end of a journey that never truly ends. Because how do you close the story of a man who built his life around never being fully known? How do you summarize someone who thrived in ambiguity, who made identity a costume and mortality a stage cue? The truth is, we don't. We can only sit with the silence he left behind and ask ourselves what it says about us. David Bowie didn't offer closure. He offered mirrors, each one reflecting a version of us we either idolize or fear becoming. In chasing his transformations, maybe we've ignored our own. In celebrating his control over narrative, maybe we've forgotten how rarely life allows that privilege. But perhaps that was his final challenge, to make us uncomfortable, to force us to confront how we consume public figures, how we demand authenticity but reward spectacle, how we glamorize tragedy and commodify grief. He handed us Blackstar, a poetic death note, and we turned it into memes, vinyl pressings, coffee table essays. Maybe that's art, or maybe that's just modern mythology. So now the question lingers, not about him, but about us. In a world where reinvention is currency and mystery is fading, do we still leave room for genuine transformation? Or do we expect every star to burn out in plain sight? Annotated and explained? Bowie once asked, "Ain't there one damn song that can make me break down and cry?" Maybe that's the answer. Not in logic, but in the feeling, in the ache, in the gaps between what we know and what we feel. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If you've stayed this long, it means you're not just chasing stories, you're seeking truth. And for that, we respect you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a truth that others try to hide. Until next time, stay curious, stay awake, and remember, not every mask is a lie. Goodbye, and see you soon.